Hey, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm gonna give you guys 5 quick tips to help you improve your photography. Whether that's on your DSLR, your mirrorless camera, your iPhone, or God forbid your Android. I'm just kidding, Androids are great too. These are tips and tricks that I've learned that have helped me improve my photography over the last couple years. But I always refer to the old saying that you gotta learn the rules before you can break them. So let's get into it. Let's talk about these tips, and here we go. My first tip is to turn on your grid function. And you can do this on your iPhone by going to the settings tab, clicking composition, and then turning on the grid function. Most DSLRs and mirrorless cameras also allow you to do this super easily. You're gonna be able to find that in your menu button really quickly and turn on that grid function. So the reason for turning on your grid is it's gonna help you see the photo broken down into these 3 different sections. And this brings us to our next tip: learning the rule of thirds. So you've probably heard this term before, but what does it actually mean? This is a compositional rule that breaks an image down into 3 horizontal and vertical thirds. From here, you want to place your subject in either the left or the right third of the image. I actually like to typically line up my image so my subject is placed directly on one of those intersecting points. This is something I'm almost always considering when I'm taking a photo. It's just lining up my image, looking at those intersecting points, and thinking about where I want to place my subject within the frame. And I know this isn't always possible, especially if your subject is moving around or if you have multiple subjects. It can be kind of hard to try and frame them in that moment, especially if you're trying to capture them in an action. So what I would recommend is actually taking your image into whatever editing software or clicking just on your iPhone and going to edit and just cropping the photo and readjusting it so you can actually bring your subject to fit or to land on one of those intersecting lines. So that kind of brings us to our next tip: cropping your image. When I bring a photo into Lightroom to edit, the first thing that I do is look at the crop. Typically, I like to make sure my horizon is perfectly straight. I just think this makes the photo look a lot more intentional, and it's basically saying to the viewer, there's an intentional reason I cropped it, and it's so that the horizon is straight, it looks pleasing to the eye, and it just looks more natural. Tip number 4 is super important, and it took me a while to kind of realize this, but pay attention to your background. You don't want something jutting out of someone's head. Usually for me, this is like a tree or a bush that's kind of poking out from someone's head in a photo. And sometimes when you're in the moment and you're shooting, you're just kind of focusing on your subject and you're making sure that you're getting them in the best light or lined up in this certain way or posing in a specific way. But then you forget to kind of look what's behind them or look what else is in the frame. And this is super important, especially when you're shooting a person, is you want to make them look good and have nothing in the frame that distracts from them. So whether that's people in the background, some crazy action happening behind them, or even just like a tree or something poking out of their head, that can be a little distracting and something that you can't really fix that well when it comes to post later. My last tip is super important as well, and that's just making sure your subject isn't blurry. And blurriness in a photo can be caused by a couple different things. A lot of the times it's just because you're moving around when you're shooting. Like if you're trying to shoot a photo and you have your iPhone, you're moving like this, it's probably gonna come out blurry. Or if you have your DSLR and you're on a slower shutter speed and you're trying to capture a person and you're kind of moving around a little bit, that's probably gonna come out blurry. Blurry photos just kind of look like you don't know what you're doing, like you just grabbed your camera and you're like, oh, I gotta get this, or your phone, you're like, oh, I gotta shoot this. You want your photos to look intentional, look like you knew what you were doing, look like you had a plan to capture your subject, make sure they're in focus, and make sure you're really getting a clean image. So I would recommend, if you're shooting on your iPhone, just tapping whatever you're gonna shoot, make sure that autofocus locks on and you can capture them. Or if you're on a DSLR or a mirrorless camera, make sure your autofocus is locked on to whatever you're shooting. Or if you're in manual mode, make sure you're just looking at your focus ring and you're turning that so whatever you're shooting is in crystal clear focus. That's super important. So just to wrap it up, here are the 5 tips again. Number 1 is to turn on your grid. Number 2 is to pay attention to the rule of thirds. Number 3 is to crop your image. Number 4 is to pay attention to your background. And number 5 is don't shoot a blurry photo. So these are just a couple basic tips to help you improve your photos. If you guys have any questions or comments, feel free to drop them in the comments below and I'll get back to you. If you guys haven't already, hit that subscribe button. I'm gonna be posting new tips and tricks every week, and thanks for watching. That pretty much wraps it up, and I'll catch you next week. See ya.